Mhm. Got it. Okay. There we go. Now we got it. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Aldana. I'm going to be presenting my project called Understanding the True Context, Guatemalan and Western Confusion and Non-Western Narratives. Sorry about that. My supervisors are Professor Freya Shiwi and Professor Sarita C. Um, and I thank them for all the help they've given me in this project throughout the quarter and this quarter. And so to get started, this past February, Guatemala made history in the film industry with its first ever Golden Globe nomination for the film La Llorona, a film that injects a common horror folklore into a narrative about Guatemala's delicate war history. This film comes from Guatemalan director and screenwriter Jairo Bustamante, who's been making rounds in and out of Guatemala for his films that focus on Guatemalan culture and society and that hold up mirrors the harsh realities of discrimination and erasure in Mayan culture in Guatemala. His films focus on the complexity of the Mayan culture within a country like Guatemala, where despite roughly half the population of their people being indigenous communities, their voices and stories are still being questioned by critics and scholars of Ladino, Creole descent in and out of Guatemala. Bustamante and his films don't shy away from calling out the ingrained racism that has been a part of Guatemala and has partially fueled the 30-year-long war in Guatemala against the Mayan people in the 20th century and has continued to have lasting effects in Guatemala to this day. To give you guys a background on Guatemala's recent history, the Civil War started roughly around the 1960s after years of economic, cultural, and social relations in Guatemala that were marked by profound exclusion, antagonism, and racism. With the outbreak of internal confrontation, Guatemala entered a tragic and devastating history with enormous human, material, and moral cost. In the documentation of human rights and violation acts against the armed confrontation, the Commission for Historical Clarification, the CEH, registered a total of 42,275 victims, including men, women, and children. Of these, 23,671 were victims of arbitrary execution, and 6,159 were victims of forced disappearance. Combining this data with the results of other studies, we find out that in Guatemala, the CEH has estimated that the amount of persons killed or disappeared as a result of fratricidal confrontation within Guatemala as a result of this war came to reach a total of over 200,000 victims. Guatemala's civil war is very much a genocide against the Mayan people that was perpetrated by a patriarchal militaristic government that was so determined to make Guatemala catch up with the rest of the world that they sacrificed their own people in the process. Multiple lives were lost, villages were decimated, families were forever separated. This was a calculated and planned out event in a long history of violence and exploitation perpetrated by colonizing systems of power. Not undercutting the atrocities of the war, however, Guatemalan author Arturo Arias brings up the notion of Tiitiin, an Ixil word that means deep pain as a response to the violence in Guatemala, in comparison to more commonly known Western notions of trauma. Arias speaks of Tiitiin in relation to this notion, in this Mayan notion, in relation to Mayan women who have probably been most affected by the Civil War's violent events. Tiitiin is an analogous term to trauma, but with a difference, where trauma implies suffering or helplessness as a result or an event involving actual or physical or threatened death. The Mayan woman's response hasn't included this response. This is because for them, Tiitiin is an inner or mystical experience, a spiritual process that doesn't allow them for suffering or helplessness the same way trauma does, but instead allows for the control and healing of oneself. Through Tiitiin, the need to talk about profound pain, never previously articulated by any of them, or by most Mayan women in Western eyes, was followed by the joy of being together again and the memories of their deeds and achievements and of their courage and capacity to make decisions. Arias's analysis of this Arias's analysis in these terms provides a space for interpreting the way violence shapes a community and the ways in which violence presents itself from a non-Indigenous perspective. And so coming back to La Llorona, Guatemalan activist Rigoberta Menchú was actually an extra in the movie. And I bring her up because she is closely related to Guatemala's Civil War. And I think she's a great example of what Arias speaks of when he talks about the notion of Tiitiin. Having published her testimony of her family and her experience during the Civil War of Guatemala, where she details the hardships of her family that they had gone through at the hands of the military and the subsequent escape she had made after the murder of her family. Her testimonial describes her experience as a peasant Indian Mayan woman in Guatemala. Menchú eventually returns to Guatemala after her exile to work with various Maya, Ladino, and peasant workers to achieve social and mutual reconciliation in Guatemala during the waning years of the war in the 1990s. Menchú's work as an activist for peasant women, peasant workers, mestizos, and the Maya people has spanned decades and is continually referenced in conversation in Guatemalan politics and debates to this day. Menchú therefore can be thought of as one of these Mayan women that Arias speaks of when he talks about instead of giving into the limiting individualistic notions of trauma, open up their understanding to a past experience, to a communal and spiritual notion of piitiin. And so continuing on, in researching Menchú, I had come across an interesting debate that I had come across that dealt with Rigoberto Menchú's publishing of her Testimonio in 1983. And the debate and controversy that I had come across was primarily from American scholars and critiques, and it had centered around whether or not Menchú had been lying or if she had been telling the truth in her Testimonio. And so American anthropologist David Stoll was probably the most critical of them all in his publications, all centered around exposing Menchú as a sort of puppet for the savage guerrillistas of the war and for spreading their Marxist ideology. Arturo Arias discredits many of Stoll's claims immediately in his book section called Taking Their Word, where he works with the oral technique of testimonio and its separation from Western notions of truth and lies, and the ways in which Stoll and other American critics were missing that crucial separation. Stoll disregarded that Menchú released her testimony to share her story and her experience, not to embody the whole of Mayan narrative. In this regard, Arias brings awareness of the fluidity of the way in which a testimonio can encompass the community's multiple stories and experiences as a way to form a more complete history and identity for oneself and their community. Menchú's testimonio cannot be read in the same notions of autobiographical truth and Corquez ideology of sworn testimony, where everything you say must be 100% fact, because it was not written in that context. It comes from a country where truth and fact almost always lead to death, where people are bombarded by traumatic experiences that constantly shape their understanding of their being in the world around them. It was written from a hybridization of Mayan and Catholic ideologies emblematic of the various Guatemalans who also put those systems at their forefront. And it is not understood to represent the Maya people as a whole, but offer an opening to present many more testimonials from different but closely related Mayan experiences. And so Arias's analysis of Stoll's claims of Menchú reveal the way that the United States and Latin America have very different ways of looking at things and interpreting things, not just in a literary sense, but also in the socio-political and cultural context. One side misses the entire intention of the testimonio and only focuses on the issues concerning its veracity or what's true or not, while the other side understands the fluidity of the testimonio and is telling of events personal or otherwise. It's continuing the line of thought, considering the recent international success and critical acclaim of Bustamante's recent films, and in relation to our previous conversation about different ways of interpreting between Western countries like the US and Guatemala, I'm interested in applying a similar subaltern method of analysis that Arias placed on these Western texts, on these Western-based interpretations of Guatemalan texts to Bustamante's films. So this will help explain how even though these films can be interpreted from a Western sense, it's much more productive to interpret them from a subaltern Mayan perspective that works with notions like piitiin, for example, instead of Western notions like trauma. And so this analysis will help reveal how Bustamante's films hold up these metaphorical mirrors that show the Guatemalan people a non-objective history of their country. And so our first film goes to Jairo Bustamante's first film is called Ishkanu, which can be interpreted as meaning female volcano in the Caxel language. And this film was a co-production between France, Guatemala in the 2015, and it follows the cycling narrative of an indigenous woman named Maria and her mother Juana and their family's life in an indigenous volcano-side village in Guatemala. The film is very much about the relationship between mother and daughter and the dynamics of the generational difference of Mayan culture. The film follows Maria's interactions within Mayan traditions and the ways in which her mother and her navigate through these identities. In the film, Juana is representative of the past generation of Mayan women who strictly adhere to the traditions and beliefs of Mayan culture, partaking in religious ceremonies, commitment to arranged marriages, believing women are to be the homemakers of the house only, while Maria, her daughter, is a part of the next generation, someone who only follows these traditions because she has to, not necessarily because she believes in them or not believes in them. She just navigates herself through these systems the best she can. The film begins and ends with a cycling narrative of the same scene of Juana dressing up Maria for her arranged marriage to the local coffee plantation manager Ignacio, establishing establishing the cyclical nature of both the film's narrative and of Mayan culture. Maria went through a very powerful experience in finding her sexual freedom and agency in her culture and in the film. In watching this film, we can infer that what Maria went through was a traumatic experience, yes. But if we consider it from a non-Western indigenous perspective, we can see that applying the notion of Biitzin, we get a much different perspective. Bustamante's application of a cyclical narrative and nature in Mayan culture and in the film that he pronounces through the differences between Juana and Maria transmits Bustamante's implication of the cyclical narrative that he transmits through Maria and Juana's story in the film helps him establish the cyclical narrative within the film that will help transmit the idea that this story of Juana and Maria of fighting these traditions of traditional Mayan values will continue, but that with each cycle through, the next Mayan woman may become more and more free of the traditions and will continue to be broken, and they will continue to break these traditions more and more. It may not have happened for Maria, but we see that they don't idly stand by and let the men in their lives ruin or run their lives. They express some agency in one way or another. So Maria and Juana's stories then allow for the process of Biitzin to occur, in that this film becomes a communicative and spiritual process of experience and learning and knowledge that instead of ending on a depressing note of a woman being forced into marriage and losing her child, turns the narrative into one that promises the slow but eventual freedom of the Mayan woman, starting with Juana, failing with Maria, but perhaps succeeding in the next generation. This brings us back to Bustamante's most recent film and got Guatemalan nomination for the Best Foreign Language Film at the 2021 Golden Globes, La Llorona. In comparison with these previous films, this one tackles Guatemala's Civil War more head-on, revolving around the family of an ex-fictional Civil War general. The film is a horror retelling of the common Latin American myth, La Llorona, where a woman in a jealous fit of rage murders her sons and daughters and then kills herself in a river, and then comes back as a wailing spirit trying to look for them. But in Bustamante's version, however, he turns this around and turns the folktale on its head and reimagines the story in relation with Guatemalan's violent war history. And in the film, La Llorona is reimagined as the spirit of a Mayan woman named Alma, who after having her kids drowned in the river by the fictional general Enrique Monteverde and being killed afterwards, comes back to not necessarily wreak revenge, but she comes back to seek justice for the lives and people disappeared during the war. And so Monteverde, along with his family in this film, are a clever allusion to the real life Efrain Rios Montt and his family. Rios Montt is infamous for his involvement in the genocide of the Mayan Ixil people in the 1980s during the Civil War of Guatemala. With Monteverde's lighthouse sentence and the house arrest, with Monteverde's lighthouse arrest sentence and hundreds of angry protesters demanding Monteverde's head, Alma makes it her spiritual journey to seek justice for the people who were disappeared by Monteverde's military regime. Once Alma arrives at the house, passing off as his new maid, she basically helps the woman of the house, Monteverde's wife, daughter, and granddaughter, all go through their own transformative journeys and spiritual understandings of themselves to understand the hidden atrocities of the Ladino elite that they are a part of, and that they each respectively chose to repress, chose not to believe, or had no idea of. And so looking at this film, it might seem a little bit strange to center it around a dictator's family who created such atrocities throughout the war, right? And it might seem weird to include this story of repentance and redemption as a story of civil war. But looking at it from a non-Western perspective, a Guatemalan perspective, Bustamante's film again holds a mirror up to the intended audience that it needs to hold the mirror up to. This time holding a mirror up to the Ladino audience base in Guatemala that tries to connect to the Civil War. Where Ishkanu held up a mirror to the slowly changing cultural evolution of the Mayan culture, La Llorona forces its middle and upper class viewers into an uncomfortable viewing position of watching these characters deal with the actuality of their privileged status throughout the war and the collusion with the military in the United States. And it shows a very powerful and emotional act of repentance for those past mistakes. The notion of BTN then makes its way back in an unusual way into Bustamante's films, this time providing a space for a reevaluation of a more Ladino and Mestizo-based audience. And then together with Ishkanu, Bustamante then provides two very effective entries into discussing the social, political, and economic environment of Guatemala during and after the war, and it offers different Guatemalan groups ways to navigate through and make sense of their place within the country. Bustamante's films have received critical acclaim, and it's important to remember that these films are made to be understood for and by Guatemalan audiences before any other demographic. Understanding these past interpretations and misinterpretations of non-Western texts, like Rigoberta Menchu's testimony, is important for preventing the same misinterpretations from happening in different fields of storytelling, like Bustamante's films. The non-Western interpretations and ideas that are presented and applied to more traditional texts, like the ones Arias analyzed, can be applied to more contemporary forms of expression like filmmaking, which is slowly but surely becoming a more prominent field in Guatemala, thanks to Bustamante's efforts to create an actual filmic landscape within the recent years. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much. Gracias, Matios. And I just want to give another thanks to my supervisors, Professor Freya Shiwi and Professor Sarita C, for helping me out throughout the quarter and making sure I completed this project and had something to show off. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kevin. If you can please stop recording before we